I watched her laugh with her son, my ex-husband, from across the sterile hospital cafeteria. She caught my eye and gave me a small, pitying smile, the same one she gave me the day we buried my son. She thought she had won, that she had successfully excised me from the family. But she was a surgeon's wife, not a surgeon. She had no idea I was about to perform a much more complicated and final procedure. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to Revenge Mindset for more gripping tales of justice and payback. Like this video and drop a comment with your country. It's always fascinating to see where our listeners are from. Let's begin. It's a funny thing, the architecture of a lie. A well-constructed one, anyway. It isn't just a statement of untruth. It's a world. A complete, self-sustaining ecosystem with its own climate, its own logic, its own carefully balanced predators and prey. Eleanor Vance was a master architect. The world she built was a beautiful, sun-drenched suburban paradise, and in it she was the benevolent sun, warming everyone with her love and concern. And I was the storm cloud she had to regretfully, tearfully banish for the good of the realm. The dinner was a performance piece, staged in the immediate aftermath of the demolition of my life. The air was thick with unspoken words, heavy as the scent of the wilting lilies that served as the centerpiece. It was a wake, though no one would call it that. A wake for my marriage. A wake for the future I had meticulously planned. Eleanor, of course, was the grieving matriarch, presiding over the affair with a practiced, somber grace. She moved around the table, a touch on a shoulder here, a whispered word of comfort there, her every gesture a masterpiece of feigned empathy. I was the guest of honor and the ghost at the feast, all at once. An object of pity, a cautionary tale. I felt their eyes on me. The friends. The remnants of a social circle that had once been mine. They looked at me with a soft, careful sadness. The way you look at a wounded animal you know you can't save. They saw the shell of a woman, the young, brilliant Dr. Miller, now just Jessica. The poor, fragile thing who had lost a child, lost a husband, and by all accounts was in the process of losing her mind. It was a perfect diagnosis. And Eleanor had written every word of the chart. She waited until the dessert plates were cleared, until the coffee was poured. The timing, like everything else, was calculated. She needed an audience, but a small, intimate one. Enough to bear witness, not enough to be a crowd. She approached my end of the table, her movements fluid. Her expensive silk blouse whispering against the silence. "We are all so worried about you. Dear," she began, her voice a low, conspiratorial hum. It was the voice she used when she was about to administer poison as if it were medicine. Her hand rested on my forearm, a gesture that, to the untrained eye, was one of comfort. I, however, had learned to see beyond the visible spectrum of human interaction. I could feel the microscopic tremors of her triumph vibrating through my skin. This is where the story you think you know ends, and the story that actually happened begins. As her words hung in the air, a part of my mind, the part that had been dormant, the part that had been sedated by grief and shock, flickered to life. It was the doctor, the analyst. The part of me that sees a symptom and works backward, methodically, to find the disease. Her words were, "We are all so worried about you." The delivery was a masterpiece of subtext. The slight tilt of her head indicating condescension. The furrowing of her brow, a pantomime of concern. The subtle downward curl of her lip, a micro-expression of contempt, lasting precisely 0.5 seconds before it was corrected. A classic narcissistic maneuver designed to assert dominance while performing the role of caregiver. She was establishing the narrative for her audience. Eleanor, the loving matriarch. Jessica, the broken patient. Assumption, I am the patient. Reality, she is the disease. And I am the cure. Grief can make us unstable, she continued, her thumb stroking my arm in a gesture that was meant to soothe but felt like she was testing the integrity of a wound. There are wonderful doctors who can help with episodes like yours, an interesting choice of word. Vague yet clinical. It medicalized my pain, turning my righteous, justifiable anger into a symptom of a disordered mind. It was brilliant. It was the cornerstone of her entire campaign. For a year, she had laid the groundwork. The misplaced keys, the forgotten appointments, the whispers to friends about how I was struggling, how I was fragile, how the pressure of my residency was getting to me. Each was a single brick, laid with meticulous care, until she had built a prison of perception around me. And the most ingenious part? She convinced everyone, including my own husband, that it was a sanctuary built for my own protection. She had weaponized my profession against me. Who would question the concerned observations of a loving mother-in-law about a young doctor burning the candle at both ends? It was a plausible, even sympathetic narrative. And every time I tried to fight back, every time I insisted, she moved them, or that's not what I said, my protests only served as further confirmation of the diagnosis. See how hysterical she's getting? The poor thing, her greatest work, of course, was Robert. My husband. A good man. A kind man. But a man who had spent his entire life orbiting the gravitational pull of his mother. He was her masterpiece of manipulation. She had programmed him from birth to see her as the ultimate source of love and stability, and to interpret any challenge to her authority as a threat to his own. When I tried to tell him what she was doing, I wasn't just criticizing his mother. I was destabilizing his entire universe. He couldn't see the bars of the cage because she had convinced him they were the pillars of his home. And then, the pregnancy. Our son. He was going to be the bond that finally, irrevocably, made us a family separate from her. A new nucleus. A new center of gravity. And she couldn't have that. An independent variable is anathema to a narcissist. It's a contaminant in their sterile, controlled world. So she did what any good scientist would do upon discovering a contaminant. She moved to eradicate it. She started small. A whisper here, a seed of doubt there. Preying on Robert's deepest insecurities. It's just, you two were having such a hard time. It's a miracle you conceived right then. Innocent words. Deadly intent. She manufactured evidence. A hotel receipt she found while helping me tidy up. A story about a male colleague of mine that she twisted into something ugly and suggestive. The culmination was a procedure of breathtaking cruelty. I was in my 3rd trimester, under immense stress from her constant interference, and I developed a complication. Preeclampsia. My blood pressure was dangerously high. The doctor ordered strict bed rest. I was vulnerable, isolated, terrified. The perfect conditions for surgery. She chose her moment perfectly. She sat with Robert in the living room while I was trying to rest. She didn't have to shout. She just had to present her concerns. Her doubts. She had been collecting them for months. And now she laid them all out, each one a polished, sharpened instrument. The resulting argument was the final, critical step of the protocol. He came into the bedroom, his face a mask of pain and confusion, and he confronted me. He repeated her words, her manufactured doubts. The stress of his accusations, of her betrayal. It was a textbook trigger. My blood pressure spiked. The contractions started. It was violent and it was fast. He didn't survive. In the aftermath, she was magnificent. She held her grieving son. She managed the funeral arrangements. She accepted the condolences of friends and family, her face a perfect mask of tragic stoicism. And she cemented the narrative. It wasn't her, it was me. My emotional instability, my hysteria. The tragedy was simply the inevitable, catastrophic symptom of my pre-existing condition. She had committed the perfect murder, and then she had signed the death certificate, listing the cause of death as my own broken mind. So, when she stood there, in the wreckage of the world she had annihilated, and offered me the business card of a psychiatrist, it wasn't an act of cruelty. It was a victory lap. It was the architect, standing on the rubble of a demolished building, pointing to the flawless blueprint and saying, "See? It all went exactly according to plan." And in that moment, as I looked into her cold, triumphant eyes, the grief inside me didn't die. It crystallized. It transformed from a liquid, chaotic agony into something hard and sharp and perfectly, terrifyingly clear. I finally understood the diagnosis. And I knew, with the absolute certainty of a surgeon holding a scalpel over an exposed malignancy, what the treatment protocol had to be. I let a single tear escape and roll down my cheek. A prop. A piece of wardrobe for the role she had cast me in. I gave her a small, broken smile. "You're right, Eleanor," I said, my voice a carefully modulated whisper of defeat. "I am seeing a specialist." The lie landed perfectly. The friends around the table exchanged looks of sad relief. Good. She's finally accepting help. Robert, sitting beside his mother, looked at me with the pained guilt of a man who knows he has hurt the person he loves, but is comforted by the belief that it was, ultimately, for her own good. He had no idea. None of them did. The specialist I was seeing was myself. The patient wasn't me. And the treatment? was just beginning. My old life was a casualty of war. The Jessica who believed in patience and understanding, the one who thought she could win Eleanor over with kindness. She died in that hospital bed with my son. The woman who walked out of that hospital was different. A reconstruction. The empathy had been cauterized, burned away to stop the bleeding. What was left was the scaffolding, the intellect, the discipline, the encyclopedic knowledge of the human body and the human mind. The tools of my trade. I had simply decided to apply them to a new, more specialized field of medicine. My colleagues saw my return to work as a brave step, a sign of healing. They would watch me from a distance as I went about my rounds. They'd see me treating patients with a quiet, focused care, and they'd nod to each other. She's finding purpose in her work. She's going to be okay. How are we feeling today, Mrs. Gable? I asked. My voice was soft. The perfect bedside manner. She gave me a weak smile. Like a rusty old engine, doctor, sputtering, I checked her chart. Congestive heart failure. A chronic condition. The heart weakened, unable to pump effectively, causing a cascade of failures throughout the entire system. Lungs filling with fluid. Limbs swelling. The body, in its desperation, slowly poisoning itself. I listened to the wet, crackling sound in her lungs. I made a note to increase her diuretic. A simple, logical step. A protocol to follow. You identify the problem, fluid retention. You administer the solution, Lasix. You observe the result, a clearing of the lungs, an easing of the burden on the heart. It was a world of cause and effect. A world that made sense. And as I stood there, listening to this woman's failing heart, I thought of Eleanor. Her pathology was not so different. A narcissistic heart, unable to pump out genuine love or empathy, creating a toxic backup in the entire family system. Her children, her husband, her friends, they were all drowning in the fluid of her endless need for validation and control. She too was a chronic condition, malignant, progressive, and left untreated, ultimately fatal to the system. My colleagues saw me as a healer, a doctor finding solace in her calling. They were wrong. I was no longer a healer. I was a researcher. Every patient was a textbook. Every disease a lesson. I was studying the myriad ways a system can break down, the subtle signs of decay, the precise points of leverage required to either stabilize or destabilize. I was completing a fellowship in a field of my own invention, the study of radical targeted excision. That night, the mask of Dr. Miller came off. My home was my operating theater. A clean room, free of contaminants. Here, the real work was done. I sat at my desk, the only light in the room, the cold blue-white glow of my laptop screen. This was my new residency, my life's work. For 6 months, I had been compiling the most comprehensive pathological workup ever created for a single human subject. I hadn't been mourning. I had been observing, documenting, diagnosing. I found a page. Wait. It looks like a page from a medical journal. Subject, Eleanor Vance. Provisional diagnosis, narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, DSM-5 301.81, exhibits a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, a need for admiration, and a profound lack of empathy. Note specific behaviors observed during the family dinner on 10/26. The deployment of feigned concern as a tool for social control is consistent with covert narcissistic tactics. I had cross-referenced her every known action with the clinical criteria for NPD. I had timelines, behavioral charts, a complete psychological map. She thought she was a master of the human mind. She had no idea I had the blueprints to hers. On the screen, a complex web diagram appears. At the center, a large node labeled Eleanor. Radiating out from it are dozens of smaller nodes, each with a name. Her son Robert, her husband, her friends, Margaret, the members of her charity committees. Each node was connected by lines of varying thickness, indicating the strength of the relationship. And each node had a subfile. I know her network better than she did. I knew who depended on her for social standing, who feared her, who secretly resented her. I knew the cracks in the foundation of her social fortress. I knew exactly where to apply pressure to bring the whole structure down. Finally, I opened the last folder. Recorded manipulations. For the last 3 months of my marriage, after I first began to suspect the true depth of the toxicity, I had carried a digital audio recorder with me. A small, discreet device. I had captured hours of her whispers, her lies, her careful, poisonous manipulations. And after the funeral, when she thought I was too broken to function, she had become careless. She had boasted to her friends. She had reveled in her victory. She was right. I had done the rest of the work for her. I had unraveled. I had broken. I had lost everything. But a surgeon knows that before you can reconstruct, you must first debride the wound. You have to cut away every last trace of dead infected tissue. You have to go all the way down to the clean, healthy bone. The grief was the infection. The pain was the necrosis. And she was the disease. The work I was doing now wasn't about revenge. Revenge is a messy, emotional, imprecise art. This was medicine. It was the methodical, clinical, and total eradication of a pathogen. She assumed I was a broken woman, grieving in the dark. She had no idea I was a surgeon, sharpening my scalpels under the operating lights. She wasn't looking at a victim. She was looking at her own autopsy report, being written in real time. The diagnosis was complete. The treatment protocol was planned. The first incision was scheduled for the following week. The last 6 months were a study in stillness, a lesson in the immense power of observation. I had watched my world burn to the ground, and instead of running, I had stayed and taken notes on the fascinating properties of the ash. I cataloged every lie, every manipulation, every casual act of cruelty that led to the death of my son and the end of my life as I knew it. My grief was a laboratory, and in it I dissected the author of my pain, Eleanor Vance. I mapped her psyche, analyzed her social network, and identified her every vulnerability with the dispassionate precision of a pathologist examining a tumor. The diagnosis was clear: malignant narcissism. The prognosis, left untreated, was the continued destruction of everyone in her orbit. My period of mourning was over. My residency in the art of revenge had just begun. The first incision was planned, the scalpel was sharp, and the patient was utterly unaware she was about to be prepped for surgery. The opportunity presented itself a week later, at a cocktail party for a mutual acquaintance. The setting was pure Eleanor. Subdued lighting, expensive art on the walls, conversations held in hushed, important tones. It was a terrarium of suburban influence, and Eleanor was the most colorful and most venomous creature in the enclosure. She was holding court, of course, perched on a plush armchair, a glass of Chardonnay held aloft like a scepter. She was in the middle of a long, winding anecdote about a ski trip to Aspen. It was a story designed, like all her stories, to subtly highlight her wealth, her social connections, and her thrilling, adventurous life. I stood at the edge of the circle, a ghost in a black dress, nursing a club soda. My presence was a minor curiosity. Poor Jessica. It's so brave of her to come out. I could hear the whispers, feel the pitying glances. I let them wash over me. It was the perfect camouflage. No one pays attention to the broken. Eleanor's story involved a chance encounter with a minor celebrity, a blizzard, and a heroic ski instructor named John. It was dramatic and, to anyone who knew the truth, complete fiction. I did. From my research, I knew that the man in question, John, had not been in Aspen that year. He had been in a court-mandated rehabilitation facility in Arizona. A messy, inconvenient fact that interfered with Eleanor's heroic narrative. A predator understands the importance of the ecosystem. It doesn't just charge blindly at its prey. It studies the herd. It learns its watering holes, its grazing patterns, its social hierarchies. It understands that to isolate one, you must first understand how it connects to the whole. Eleanor's herd was the carefully curated collection of friends and admirers who orbited her, reflecting her own manufactured brilliance back at her. Her power wasn't inherent, it was granted. My first task was simple: to begin the process of revoking that grant. In my old life, I would have let it go. I would have seethed silently, another small, unprovable lie swallowed down. But the new me, the clinician, saw the lie not as an insult, but as a symptom. And a symptom is an opening, a place to insert the probe. I waited for her to deliver the punchline. The room responded with the requisite appreciative chuckles. I let the laughter die down, just enough for a small pocket of silence to form. And then I stepped into it. "That's a fascinating story, Eleanor," I said. My voice was pitched just loud enough to carry, to draw the attention of the entire circle. She looked at me, a flicker of annoyance in her eyes at being interrupted. Her smile tightened. "But I think you're misremembering," I continued, tilting my head slightly. "John wasn't in Aspen that year, he was in rehab, remember? His wife was so distraught. I delivered this information not as an accusation, but as a gentle correction. A shared memory clarified. A few people in the circle shifted uncomfortably. Before Eleanor could formulate a response, could marshal her defenses, I administered the anesthetic. "It's all right," I said, my voice softening with professional empathy. Confabulation is quite common, a sort of memory error where the brain fills in gaps with fabricated details. We see it often in patients with high blood pressure. It's nothing to be alarmed about, but it is something to be aware of. "Have you had yours checked recently?" The silence that followed was exquisite. It was a deep, profound silence, the kind that follows a sudden, sharp noise in a quiet library. I had not called her a liar. I had diagnosed her. I had taken her fiction and reframed it as a medical symptom. I had expressed nothing but concern for her well-being. It was a perfect, untraceable incision. She couldn't lash out at me. How could she? I was just poor, fragile Jessica trying to be helpful, using the only language I knew, the language of medicine. She was stunned. A rare and beautiful sight. She had built her fortress walls so high, and I hadn't bothered trying to scale them. I had simply walked up to the gate, dressed as a doctor, and informed the guards that their queen might be suffering from a minor neurological condition. The first incision, I thought as I watched the ripple of uncertainty spread through the small crowd. They weren't looking at me with pity anymore. They were looking at Eleanor with a new subtle calculation in their eyes. The objective is not to challenge the lie, but to challenge the liar's capacity for truth. Introduce a medical variable. The herd will begin to question the health of its leader. My emotional state was one of pure, cold, professional satisfaction. The satisfaction of a perfectly executed differential diagnosis. I held her gaze for a moment longer, my face a mask of gentle worry. Then I gave a small, sad smile and turned, melting back into the shadows of the party. The procedure was a success. The seed of doubt had been planted. Now I just had to water it. Phase 2 required a more targeted approach. A narcissist's power is amplified by their closest allies, their lieutenants. These are the people who normalize their behavior, who co-sign their lies, who act as a buffer between the narcissist and a world that might otherwise hold them accountable. Eleanor's chief lieutenant, her primary source of validation, was a woman named Margaret. Margaret was Eleanor's shadow, her echo. She was a woman of similar social standing, but lacked Eleanor's predatory charisma. Theirs was a symbiotic relationship. Margaret provided Eleanor with unwavering admiration, and in return, Eleanor allowed Margaret to bask in her reflected glory. To destabilize Eleanor, I had to separate her from her primary enabler. It was textbook. To kill a tumor, you must first cut off its blood supply. My research into Margaret had yielded a critical piece of medical data, a severe, life-threatening allergy to penicillin. The kind that requires an EpiPen and a trip to the emergency room. It was a powerful vulnerability, a precise and unforgiving leverage point. The plan was simple, elegant, and completely untraceable. I curated a gift basket. The centerpiece was a selection of artisanal cheeses from a small local creamery. One of them, a particularly delicious blue cheese, was made using a penicillium mold. To the average person, it was a delicacy. To Margaret, it was a biological weapon. I included a small, unsigned card. The handwriting was a flowery, feminine script, practiced for weeks to be unrecognizable as my own sharp clinical scrawl. It read, "Thought of you." From a friend of Eleanor's. The ambiguity was key. It could have been from any number of people in their wide social circle. But the mention of Eleanor would immediately link the gift, and its consequences, back to her. I had it delivered by a courier service, paid for in cash. No paper trail. No digital footprint. I was a ghost. I gave it 2 hours. Then, I checked the local hospital's emergency room admissions, using my credentials to access the real-time patient tracker. And there she was. Margaret Allister, admitted for anaphylactic shock. The reaction had been severe but not fatal. Exactly as intended. Harm, when necessary, must be precise. I waited another day, allowing the fear and confusion to marinate. Then I made the call. "Margaret, it's Jessica Miller. Oh my God, I just heard what happened. Are you all right?" Her voice on the other end was weak, raspy from the intubation. She recounted the story in terrified fragments. The cheese. The sudden closing of her throat. The ambulance. I listened patiently, interjecting with gasps of sympathy. "That's terrifying," I said. "But the basket, who was it from?" "I don't know," she rasped. The card just said it was from a friend of Eleanor's. And there it was. The opening. A friend of Eleanor's? I said, letting a note of confusion enter my voice. Oh, Margaret. You don't think... Eleanor knows about your allergy, doesn't she? Of course she does, Margaret said, a note of indignation in her weak voice. We've been friends for 30 years. I know, it's just... I let the sentence hang in the air. A carefully calculated pause. It's just that Eleanor has been so, forgetful lately. A little careless. Did you notice at the party the other night? She seemed quite confused about that story with John. I didn't need to push any harder. The seed I had planted at the party, the idea of Eleanor's cognitive decline, now had fertile, terrified ground in which to grow. I had given Margaret a plausible, terrifying explanation for what had happened. It wasn't a malicious attack from a stranger. It was a catastrophic act of carelessness from her oldest, most trusted friend. A friend who was, perhaps, becoming unreliable. Unsafe. I ended the call with more effusive expressions of sympathy and well wishes. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my apartment. My heart rate was steady. My breathing was even. I felt no guilt. No remorse. I felt the quiet, grim satisfaction of a successful procedure. I had introduced a pathogen, doubt, into the bloodstream of their friendship. Now I would simply observe as the infection ran its course. Separating a narcissist from their primary source of validation is a delicate, multi-stage operation. The initial separation is just the beginning. The next step is to ensure the separation is permanent by destroying the host's reputation within the broader ecosystem. Eleanor's power was built on a carefully constructed image of competence and grace. It was time to introduce the variable of public failure. The annual hospital charity fundraiser was Eleanor's crown jewel. As the chair of the organizing committee, it was her stage, her yearly opportunity to perform her role as the city's most gracious and effective philanthropist. Her success was a foregone conclusion. She had been running it for a decade. It was a well-oiled machine. But even the most well-oiled machine can be brought to a grinding halt by a single well-placed grain of sand. I joined the organizing committee. It was the last thing anyone expected. "It's so wonderful that you're ready to get involved again, dear," Eleanor had said, her voice dripping with condescension. She thought my involvement was a sign that I was healing, that I was ready to re-enter her orbit. She placed me on the digital presentation subcommittee, a meaningless, low-level job managing the slideshow that would run behind her during her keynote address. She assumed I was a harmless, broken little bird. She had no idea she had just handed the fox the keys to the henhouse. I had legitimate access to the hospital's IT systems. It was a simple matter to access the presentation file from my own workstation. I didn't need to do anything dramatic. A virus, a corrupted file. That would be too obvious, too traceable. The goal was not to sabotage the presentation, but to sabotage her. The changes I made were tiny, microscopic, the digital equivalent of a single, misplaced suture. On the slide listing the platinum-level donors, I subtly misspelled the name of the city's most prominent banking family, a I where an I should be. On the slide detailing the hospital's financial achievements, I altered a key figure. I didn't change it by much, just enough to be wrong. A budget surplus of $1.5 million became $1.3 million, a number that would feel wrong to any board member in the audience, but not so wrong as to be an obvious typo. I inserted a dozen such tiny errors, each one a small, imperceptible flaw. Alone, they were nothing. Together, they would create a tapestry of incompetence. The night of the gala, I sat at a table in the back of the ballroom and watched. Eleanor took the stage to thunderous applause. She was radiant, confident, in her element. She began her speech, her voice smooth and practiced, her eyes fixed on the teleprompter that was feeding her the script that I had so carefully proofread. The first error appeared 2 minutes in. The misspelled name, Eleanor, reading from the prompter, didn't notice. She sailed right past it. But a few people in the audience did. A quiet murmur, a confused glance between spouses. The next error, the incorrect financial figure, came a minute later. This time, the reaction was more pronounced. More whispers. People were starting to look from the screen to their programs and back to the screen. Eleanor, cocooned in the bubble of her own performance, remained oblivious. She continued to read the flawed data with absolute conviction. It was a cascade failure. With each new slide, a new subtle error. A wrong date. A misattributed quote. The name of a new hospital wing, slightly but consistently wrong. To the audience, it didn't look like a technical glitch. It looked like the woman on stage was unprepared, sloppy, incompetent. The whispers grew louder. The confident energy in the room began to curdle into a miasma of secondhand embarrassment. She finally faltered. She lost her place on the teleprompter. She stammered. For the first time in her public life, Eleanor Vance was flustered. She fumbled through the end of her speech, her voice tight, her face flushed. The applause at the end was polite, but tepid. The spell was broken. The image of the flawless, competent matriarch had a crack in it. A deep, visible, undeniable crack. She walked off the stage not to a crowd of adoring admirers, but to the anxious, questioning faces of the board members. Her reign of effortless perfection was over. I felt a surge of something cold and powerful. It was the thrill of a successful, complex surgery. The clean, quiet satisfaction of a hypothesis proven correct. I had not destroyed her. I had simply held up a distorted mirror and let the world see a flawed reflection. But in the flush of victory, I made a mistake. I became complacent. I underestimated one of the other variables in the equation. My ex-husband, Robert. He found me as I was about to leave. He had been on the board for a year, a position his mother had, of course, secured for him. He had seen the whole thing from the front row. He came and stood beside me, not looking at me, but looking out at the crowd as they swarmed his mother with concerned questions. "This seems like something you would do," he said. His voice was low, flat, devoid of emotion. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. A diagnosis. The words hit me like a splash of ice water. For a split second, the mask of detached sadness, the one I had worn for months, almost slipped. My heart rate, which had been as steady as a metronome, suddenly spiked. 120 beats per minute, a physiological response to a perceived threat. A flash of pure, cold fury, the real, undiluted rage I kept locked away, flickered in my eyes. I could feel the heat of it on my face. He saw it. He saw me. It was a critical moment. A close call. My entire operation, my meticulously constructed narrative, was on the verge of collapsing. I needed to turn his suspicion back on itself. I needed to make him feel guilty for even thinking it. I needed to become the victim again. I forced my breathing to become shallow. I summoned the memory of my son's face, the cold, sterile feel of the hospital sheets. It was a dark, ugly place to go, but it was a reliable trigger for the desired physiological response. Tears welled in my eyes. My lip began to tremble. I turned to him, my face a perfect portrait of wounded disbelief. "How can you say that to me, Robert?" I whispered, my voice cracking. I let a sob catch in my throat. "After everything? After what she did? You think I would do something like this? You think I'm her?" I had taken his suspicion and held it up to him like a mirror. I was turning his own weapon, his own doubt, back against him. His accusation was no longer about me. It was about his own complicity, his own guilt for having believed her over me. It worked. The suspicion in his eyes vanished, replaced by a wave of shame. He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "Jess, I'm sorry," he stammered. "I didn't mean... It's just... It was so strange, I said, my voice rising with practiced hysteria. "My whole life is strange now, Robert. It's broken. And she broke it. And you stood there, and you watched her." He backed down. Immediately. He was filled with apologies, with guilt, with the familiar, pained confusion that had been his default state for our entire marriage. I let him apologize. I let him comfort me. I played the part of the grieving, hysterical widow to perfection. But as he wrapped his arms around me in a clumsy, guilt-ridden hug, I felt nothing. No comfort. No lingering affection. Just the cold, steady beat of my own heart, returning to its resting rate. The threat had been neutralized. The system was stable again. He walked me to my car, still apologizing. I accepted with a weary, tragic grace. As I drove away, I looked at him in my rearview mirror, a solitary, confused figure under the glittering lights of the hotel canopy. The risk had been real. I had become bolder, and with it, more reckless. I had been so focused on the primary tumor that I had neglected to account for the surrounding tissue. This was a warning, a wake-up call. The quiet, methodical campaign of 1,000 paper cuts was no longer enough. Her suspicions were aroused. Robert was watching. My window of opportunity was closing. It was time to accelerate the protocol. It was time to schedule the final radical excision. The close call with Robert was a clinical warning, a sudden, unexpected arrhythmia in the otherwise steady rhythm of my plan. For months, I had been the observer, the analyst, the surgeon working from a safe, sterile distance. But in that moment, under the harsh lights of the ballroom, I was reminded that the subject of my study was not some passive disease under a microscope. It was a complex, unpredictable system, and my interference was causing ripples I hadn't fully anticipated. Robert's suspicion was a sign of an immune response. The system was becoming aware of my presence. The time for subtle exploratory surgery was over. A slow, methodical excision was no longer a viable option. I had to move to the final stage. The radical, public, and irreversible removal of the malignancy before it had the chance to adapt and metastasize its lies any further. The next procedure would not be a delicate incision. It would be an amputation. The final act of any great performance requires the perfect stage. A place where the lighting is just right, the audience is captive, and the drama can unfold to its most devastating conclusion. I needed one last family gathering, one final performance of the happy, loving Vance family, so that I could burn the theater down with everyone inside. The occasion presented itself with grim convenience, my ex-husband Robert's birthday. A day that was once a celebration of our shared life would now become the backdrop for the final dissection of his. I knew Eleanor would insist on hosting. After the public humiliation of the charity gala, she would be desperate for an opportunity to reassert her authority, to pull her flock back into the fold and remind them who their shepherd was. It was the predictable behavior of a predator that feels its territory is being threatened. She would create a grand, beautiful spectacle of family unity, and she would place herself at the center of it, the benevolent, loving matriarch, healing the wounds she herself had inflicted. It was the perfect stage. All I had to do was write the final scene. I was the last to arrive. My entrance caused the intended ripple of unease. Conversation stopped. All eyes turned to me. I was dressed simply, in black, my face composed in a mask of quiet, melancholic dignity. I was no longer just the grieving widow. I was a question mark, an object of suspicion and fascination. The rumors from the gala had spread. The stories of Eleanor's forgetfulness had taken root. The herd was unsettled. I found Robert and wished him a happy birthday. The hug was awkward, a chasm of unspoken things between us. He looked at me with a pained, searching expression. The guilt from our last encounter was still fresh. "I'm glad you came, Jess," he said, his voice low. "I wouldn't miss it," I replied, and the words were true. Just not in the way he understood them. Eleanor glided towards me, her smile a brittle, painted thing. She was the picture of a gracious hostess, but I could see the tension in the set of her jaw, the slight tremor in the hand that held her wine glass. She saw my presence not as an olive branch, but as a challenge. A final, insolent refusal to stay in the box she had built for me. She placed a cold hand on my arm. "Jessica, dear, we're all so glad you felt up to it," she said, her voice a symphony of condescension. "We were all so worried after your little outburst at the gala." She was already laying the groundwork, reminding the audience of my supposed instability. I simply smiled. "I'm fine, Eleanor. Thank you for your concern." The party moved with a slow, agonizing tension. It was a cold war fought with polite smiles and passed hors d'oeuvres. I could feel Eleanor watching my every move, her eyes following me as I circulated, making small, meaningless conversation. She was waiting for her moment, and so was I. It came as I knew it would after the cake had been cut. She clinked a fork against her champagne flute, the sharp, clear sound cutting through the low hum of chatter. The room fell silent. All faces turned to her. Showtime. "A toast," she began, her voice thick with manufactured emotion. "To my wonderful son, Robert." She spoke about his childhood, about how proud she was of him. It was a beautiful, loving tribute. And then, the turn. The scalpel, disguised as a loving mother's concern. "This year has been difficult for our family," she said, her eyes finding mine across the room. She held my gaze. "This was for me. We have all dealt with a terrible loss. And we have all seen how grief can change a person, how it can twist them into someone unrecognizable." The room was deathly quiet. This wasn't a toast. It was an indictment. "I have tried," she continued, her voice breaking with practiced sorrow. "God knows I have tried to help poor Jessica, to guide her through her deep-seated mental issues. But she has responded to my love with cruelty, to my concern with lies and accusations. She was performing for her audience, reestablishing the narrative one last time. She was the victim, the long-suffering matriarch, forced to endure the paranoid delusions of her unstable former daughter-in-law. It was her masterpiece, her magnum opus of manipulation, and it would be her last. As she paused for a dramatic, tearful sip of her champagne, I moved. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I simply walked to the small table by the fireplace where the home's Bluetooth speaker sat, playing quiet background music. I took out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. I tapped the screen, disconnecting her music and connecting my own device. The transition was seamless. "You're right, Eleanor," I said, my voice cutting through the silent, horrified room. It was clear, cold, and steady. We should listen to the experts. And I pressed play. She was so easy to break. The recording of Eleanor's voice echoed through the silent house. It was from a phone call I had recorded weeks earlier, a call between her and Margaret. Honestly, it was almost disappointing. You just have to convince them they're crazy, and they do the rest of the work for you. Robert believes anything I tell him. He's a good boy. The recording continued, a 30-second monologue of her triumph, detailing with gleeful, narcissistic pride exactly how she had manipulated her son, gaslit me, and orchestrated the entire campaign that led to the destruction of my life. The sound ended. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that follows an explosion. Every eye in the room was on Eleanor. Her public image, the fortress she had spent a lifetime building, had been vaporized in 30 seconds. The benevolent sun had been revealed to be a black hole, consuming everything around it. The architect was buried in the rubble of her own creation. The trap was sprung. The surgery, a success. I walked through the stunned crowd, a surgeon moving through a silent, shocked operating theater. I stopped directly in front of the now catatonic Eleanor. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it was almost beautiful. She was finally truly seeing me, not the patient. The doctor, I didn't raise my voice. I leaned in close so that only she could hear me. My voice was a low, clinical whisper. "Stage 4 narcissism," I said. My voice as sterile as a steel tray of instruments, malignant and untreatable. The only course of action was a radical excision. For the health of the entire system. I turned and walked away. I didn't look at Robert. I didn't look at any of them. They were no longer my concern. My work here was done. I walked through the front door and out into the cool night air, leaving the ruins of the Vance family behind me in that silent, suffocating room. As the door clicked shut behind me, I felt a wave of something wash over me. It wasn't joy. It wasn't happiness. It was the quiet, empty, profound satisfaction of a complex procedure successfully completed. The removal of a sickness. The restoration of a baseline. As I reached my car, the front door of the house flew open. It was Robert. He ran out, stopping a few feet away from me on the lawn. He didn't shout. He didn't apologize. He didn't try to explain. He just looked at me, his face pale and shattered in the moonlight. It was a new kind of look. The pained confusion was gone. The guilt was gone. He wasn't looking at his ex-wife. He wasn't looking at the woman he had once loved. He was looking at something powerful and cold and terrifyingly unfamiliar that he had never known existed. He was looking at the surgeon, not the woman. And for the first time in his life, he was looking at me with fear. I met his gaze. I held it. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't offer an explanation. I gave him a single, chillingly neutral nod. An acknowledgement. A final clinical sign-off. I got in my car. The engine started with a quiet, efficient hum, and I drove away, leaving him standing alone in the ruins of the world he had allowed his mother to build for him. My last thought was not of him, or of her, or of what I had lost. It was a final, clinical note, closing the case file. The body has been purged of the disease. Recovery is now the patient's responsibility. The diagnosis was complete. The procedure was a success. A chilling reminder that when you push a brilliant mind to the absolute brink, it may not just break. It may crystallize into something hard, sharp, and terrifyingly clear. Thank you for joining us for this dissection of a perfect revenge. If you found this story as satisfying as it was unsettling, please show your support by hitting the like button. And I really want to know your thoughts in the comments below. At what point did Jessica's justice cross the line into something else entirely? To make sure you don't miss our next deep dive into the darker corners of the human psyche, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell. Finally, the best way to support the channel is by sharing this video with someone you know who would appreciate this kind of story. Until the next diagnosis.